Sometimes, the cruelest words come from those who once claimed to love you. Eleanor Wade knew this truth as she stood in Murphy's saloon, watching her former beau announce to the whole room that no man would ever want her. The laughter that followed cut deep, but Eleanor carried a secret that would silence every mocking voice. She was already married to Cullen Holt, the wealthiest rancher in the territory, a man who saw her worth when the rest of the world had written her off. Their wedding had been quiet, away from prying eyes, but their love was real. When Cullen stepped from the shadows to claim his wife, the room went silent. The man who had just humiliated her was about to learn that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. What would happen when the truth came out? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years had passed since Eleanor Wade's world crumbled like autumn leaves beneath a hard frost. She kept a faded daguerreotype tucked in her small wooden jewelry box, a portrait of herself at 19, radiant in silk and pearls, surrounded by suitors at the Cedar Bluff harvest dance. The young woman in that photograph seemed like a stranger now, someone who had lived in a different lifetime entirely. Cedar Bluff had always been a town where your worth was measured by the size of your father's ranch and the cut of your Sunday dress. Eleanor's family had owned modest land on the outskirts, enough to keep them comfortable but never wealthy. Her true currency had been her beauty and grace gifts that had made her the belle of every social gathering, from church socials to barn raisings. Young men rode from 3 counties over just for a chance to dance with her, and their mothers whispered about which lucky family would claim her as a daughter-in-law. That was before the fire that took her father's barn and half his cattle, before the debts that forced the sale of their land piece by piece, before her mother's slow decline into an illness that drained what little remained of their savings. Eleanor had watched her family standing in the community slip away like water through cupped hands, and with it went the attention of those fair-weather suitors. The final blow came when she accepted work as a seamstress to support her ailing mother. In Cedar Bluff, ladies of good breeding didn't soil their hands with trade, no matter how desperate their circumstances. The same women who had once competed to host tea parties in her honor now crossed the street when they saw her coming. The men who had once penned flowery letters declaring their devotion suddenly found urgent business elsewhere whenever she appeared. By the time her mother passed 2 years ago, Eleanor had become invisible to polite society. She lived alone in a small rented room above Henderson's General Store, earning just enough through her needlework to keep body and soul together. At 24, she was considered well past marriageable age by local standards, a spinster whose bloom had faded along with her family's fortune. Murphy's saloon occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on Cedar Bluff's main street, sandwiched between the barber shop and the telegraph office. It served as the unofficial town hall, where ranchers gathered to discuss cattle prices, weather, and local gossip over whiskey and beer. Eleanor rarely had occasion to enter the establishment respectable. Women, even fallen ones, avoided such places. But today she had delivered a mended vest to Murphy himself, payment for which would buy her food for the rest of the week. The saloon's interior was all dark wood and brass fixtures, filled with the permanent scents of tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey, and leather. Afternoon sunlight filtered through dust-laden windows, illuminating the haze that perpetually hung in the air. A handful of men clustered around tables, their voices a low rumble of conversation, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. Eleanor had just concluded her business with Murphy and turned toward the door when a familiar voice stopped her cold. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in." Thomas Garrett stood near the bar, a half-empty glass in his hand and a cruel smile playing at his lips. He had been Eleanor's most persistent suitor in her better days, the Derm, son of a successful cattle rancher who had seemed destined to claim her hand. When her family's troubles began, Thomas had been among the first to distance himself, his ardent letters ceasing as abruptly as if his pen had simply run dry. Thomas. Eleanor's voice remained steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched her small purse tighter and took a step toward the door. "Now don't be in such a hurry to leave," Thomas said, his words slightly slurred. "We hardly get to see you anymore, what with you keeping such humble company these days." A few of the other patrons had begun to take notice, their conversations quieting as they sensed potential entertainment. Eleanor felt their eyes upon her like physical weight, measuring and judging. She had endured 3 years of such scrutiny, but it never grew easier. "I have work to finish," she said simply, hoping to end the encounter before it could escalate. "Work!" Thomas laughed, and the sound held no warmth. "That's right, you're in the sewing business now. Tell me, Eleanor, do you ever miss the old days, when you were somebody worth knowing?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. She had learned that responding to such provocations only encouraged them. "We all have our memories, Thomas. Some are worth keeping, others best forgotten." "Indeed we do," he agreed, taking another sip of his whiskey. "I remember, when you were the prettiest girl in 3 counties, every man in the territory wanted to court you. And now—" He gestured vaguely at her simple brown dress and worn boots. Eleanor's hand instinctively moved to her left glove, beneath which lay a simple gold band, her most precious secret. The ring had belonged to Cullen's grandmother, worn smooth by decades of faithful marriage. It rested against her finger like a promise, reminding her that despite what this room full of strangers might think, she was cherished by a man whose worth far exceeded their small understanding. The saloon. The door opened with a soft creak, admitting a figure that seemed to bring the shadows with him. Cullen Holt moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to commanding respect without demanding it. He was tall and lean, with steel-grey eyes that missed nothing and prematurely silver hair that spoke of hard-won experience. His black coat was well-tailored but practical, the attire of a successful man who had no need to prove his station through ostentation. Cullen had arrived in Cedar Bluff 18 months ago, purchasing the old Harrison Ranch and the 3 smaller properties that bordered it. Within 6 months, he had assembled one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. He kept to himself mostly, conducting his business with quiet efficiency and treating everyone with the same measured courtesy, regardless of their station. Some found his reserve unsettling, interpreting his reticence as arrogance. Others, particularly those who had occasion to do business with him, recognized it as the bearing of a man who had seen enough of the world to understand what truly mattered. Eleanor had first encountered him at Henderson's store, where she had been purchasing thread for her work. He had been quietly conducting business with Mr. Henderson, discussing feed orders and supply schedules. When Eleanor approached the counter, struggling with a heavy bolt of fabric, Cullen had simply stepped forward and lifted it for her without a word. Their eyes had met for just a moment, and she had seen something in his gaze that she hadn't encountered in years. Respect. That brief interaction had led to others. Cullen began appearing at the store whenever Eleanor had deliveries to make, always finding some legitimate business that required his presence. Their conversations started with polite nods and gradually evolved into exchanges about the weather, local news, and eventually more personal matters. Eleanor discovered that beneath his reserved exterior lay a man of surprising depth and gentleness, someone who understood what it meant to bear loss and find strength in solitude. Their courtship had been conducted in quiet moments and stolen glances, away from the prying eyes of a town that had already written Eleanor's story. Cullen never once mentioned her reduced circumstances or asked about her past troubles. Instead, he seemed to see her as she truly was, a woman of grace and character whose worth had nothing to do with her family's former wealth. Now, as he stood in Murphy's doorway, His presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the room. The loud conversations died to murmurs, and even Thomas Garrett straightened unconsciously, some primitive instinct recognizing the quiet authority that emanated from the newcomer. Cullen's eyes found Eleanor immediately, and she saw the slight tightening around them that indicated his displeasure with her situation. He moved through the room like a man, walking through his own home, unhurried but purposeful. When he reached the bar, he nodded politely to Murphy. "Afternoon, Murphy. I'll take a whiskey, if you please." "Certainly, Mr. Holt." Murphy's tone held the deference reserved for his most prosperous customers. "Fine day for it." "Indeed." "It is." Cullen accepted the glass and turned slightly, his position allowing him to observe both Eleanor and Thomas without appearing to do so. Thomas, emboldened by whiskey and the attention of his audience, seemed oblivious to the shift in the room's dynamics. He focused on Eleanor with renewed intensity, as if her discomfort were a form of entertainment. "You know what I remember most about the old days, Eleanor?" he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the now quiet saloon. "I remember how you used to light up a room just by walking into it. Men would stop talking mid-sentence just to watch you pass. You had your pick of anyone in the territory." Eleanor remained silent, her hand still pressed against her hidden ring. She could feel Cullen's presence like warmth from a distant fire, but she knew that any acknowledgement between them would only complicate an already difficult situation. "But time has a way of humbling us all, doesn't it?" Thomas's tone grew more pointed. "Some of us learn to adapt to reduced circumstances better than others. Some of us learn to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention we can get." The words hung in the air, like a challenge. Eleanor felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but beneath it lay something new, the quiet strength that came from knowing she was not alone in the world, even if others couldn't see it. Sheriff Kane sat at a corner table, nursing a beer and pretending to read yesterday's newspaper. Doc Harrison occupied his usual spot near the window, playing a solitary card game and occasionally glancing up at the unfolding drama. Both men had known Eleanor's family in better days and had watched her fall from grace with a mixture of sympathy and resignation. Neither felt inclined to intervene in what appeared to be a private matter between former acquaintances. The afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to grow thicker, as if the very air were holding its breath. Eleanor stood at the crossroads of her old life and her new one, surrounded by men who saw only her, past failures, and obvious to the profound change that had occurred in her circumstances. In just a few moments, that ignorance would be shattered forever, and the careful boundaries she and Cullen had maintained around their private happiness would be swept away by the force of his protective devotion. But for now, she stood alone against the weight of their judgment, her secret burning bright as a star against the gathering storm of Thomas Garrett's cruelty. Thomas Garrett's voice grew louder, feeding off the attention of his audience like a man stoking a fire. The whiskey had loosened his tongue and sharpened his cruelty, transforming what might have been a brief, uncomfortable encounter into something far more sinister. "You know what the real tragedy is, Eleanor?" He gestured with his glass, sloshing amber liquid onto the sawdust floor. "It's not that you've come. Down in the world, hell, we all face hard times. The tragedy is that you seem to think you still deserve the same respect you had when your daddy owned land worth something." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Eleanor felt the familiar burn of shame, but beneath it, something else stirred, a quiet anger that had been building for 3 long years. She had endured whispered comments and cold shoulders with dignity, but Thomas was pushing beyond the bounds of even Cedar Bluff's casual cruelty. "I've never asked for anything from this town that I didn't earn," she said, quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Haven't you?" Thomas stepped closer, invading the careful space she had maintained between them, walking around with that proud look, like you're too good for honest work, acting like you're still the belle of the ball when everyone knows. "That's enough, Thomas." The voice came from Doc Harrison, who had set down his cards and turned in his chair. The lady's done nothing to warrant such talk. The lady! Thomas laughed, but there was an edge to it now, a desperation that suggested he knew he had gone too far, but couldn't find his way back. Is that what we're calling her now? A lady doesn't take in sewing like a common seamstress. A lady doesn't live alone above a store like some what? Eleanor's voice cut through his words like a blade. For 3 years, she had absorbed every slight and insult in silence, but something in Thomas's tone, a particular ugliness that went beyond mere social snobbery, triggered a response that surprised even her. The room went dead quiet. Even Murphy stopped wiping glasses to watch the confrontation unfold. Thomas's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. He had finally provoked a reaction, and he pressed his advantage with the instincts of a man who enjoyed causing pain. Like some used-up thing that nobody wants, he said, his words carrying clearly to every corner of the saloon. Face it, Eleanor, your time has passed. Ain't nobody wanting a worn-out thing like you. Not now, not ever. The laughter that followed was scattered and uncomfortable, but it cut just the same. Eleanor felt something tear inside her chest, some last fragile hope that she might still command basic human decency from the people she had once called neighbors. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, seeking the comfort of her hidden wedding ring, but the gesture only drew Thomas's attention. Still putting on airs, I see, he sneered, reaching out to grab her wrist. Still pretending you're something special. His fingers closed around her arm with unnecessary force, and Eleanor jerked back instinctively. The sudden movement caught the fabric of her sleeve against the rough edge of a brass button on Thomas's vest, and the brown cotton tore with a sharp, ripping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. "Let go of me," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the fear that had begun to creep up her spine. Thomas was drunk enough to be dangerous, and she was alone, in a room full of men who seemed more interested in entertainment than intervention. Or what? Thomas tightened his grip, and Eleanor winced. Who's going to stop me? Who's going to defend the honor of a woman who I am? The voice came from directly behind Thomas, spoken so quietly that it barely disturbed the air, yet somehow every person in the room heard it clearly. Cullen Holt had moved with the silent precision of a man accustomed to situations where noise could mean the difference between life and death. He now stood close enough to touch Thomas's shoulder, his presence as solid and unmovable as granite. Thomas spun around, his grip on Eleanor loosening in surprise. When he saw who had spoken, his face went through a series of expressions, confusion, recognition, and finally, calculation. Everyone in Cedar Bluff knew Cullen Holt by reputation, but few had occasion to speak with him directly. Thomas clearly struggled to process this unexpected development. "Mr. Holt," he said, attempting a smile that came out, more like a grimace. "Didn't see you there. We're just having a friendly conversation with an old friend." Cullen's grey eyes moved deliberately from Thomas's face to his hand, which still gripped Eleanor's arm, then back to Thomas's face. The look conveyed volumes without requiring words. "Release her," Cullen said. It wasn't a request. Thomas's hand fell away as if Eleanor's arm had suddenly burst into flames. He took a step backward, bumping into a table and nearly knocking over an empty glass. "Now, see here," Thomas blustered, trying to regain his composure. "This is a private matter between Eleanor and myself. We have history, and—" "You have nothing," Cullen interrupted, his voice still pitched low, but carrying absolute authority. "And you will address Mrs. Holt with the respect due my wife." The words hit the saloon like a physical force. For a moment the silence was so complete that Eleanor could hear the ticking of Murphy's clock on the wall behind the bar. Then the room erupted. "Wife?" Thomas's voice cracked on the word. "Mrs. Holt?" Sheriff Kane half rose from his chair. "Well, I'll be damned," Murphy breathed, setting down his glass with shaking hands. Eleanor felt the world shift around her like a landscape rearranged by earthquake. The secret she and Cullen had guarded so carefully was now exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. She looked at her husband, for he was that, had been that for 4 months now, and saw the quiet determination in his face that she had come to know and love. Cullen stepped to Eleanor's side and offered her his arm with the same natural courtesy he might have shown at a formal dance. His movements were unhurried, almost casual, but there was something in his bearing that warned against interference. "Gentlemen," he said, nodding politely to the room at large, "I apologize for any confusion. My wife and I preferred to keep our marriage private, but circumstances have made that impossible." Eleanor placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the fine fabric of his coat. Her torn sleeve fluttered slightly in the draft from the door, a visible reminder of Thomas's aggression and the moment when her carefully maintained silence had finally been broken. Thomas stared at them both, as if they were apparitions conjured from his whiskey-soaked imagination. His face cycled through shades of red and white as the full implications of what had just been revealed began to penetrate his consciousness. "This is impossible," he said finally. "Eleanor Wade she's nobody. She's got nothing. Why would a man like you—" he gestured vaguely at Cullen's obvious prosperity. "Why would a man like me, what?" Cullen's voice remained level, but there was something dangerous lurking beneath the surface now. "Choose to marry a woman of grace, intelligence, and character? Perhaps the question you should be asking yourself is why you chose to treat her with such disrespect." The rebuke landed like a physical blow. Thomas's face flushed deeper, and Eleanor could see the struggle between his wounded pride and his growing realization that he had just made a catastrophic mistake. Doc Harrison chuckled softly from his corner table. "Well played, Mr. Holt. Well played indeed." Sheriff Kane raised his glass in a mock salute. "Congratulations to you both, though I suspect the real congratulations are in order for Mrs. Holt landing the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. Eleanor felt Cullen's arm tense slightly under her hand at the implication that he was the lucky one in their union, but he said nothing. Instead, he guided her gently toward the door, his movement a clear signal that this particular scene had reached its conclusion. "Good day, gentlemen," he said as they passed through the room. "Murphy, thank you for your hospitality." As they reached the door, Thomas's voice rang out behind them, high and desperate. "This isn't over. You can't just people will want to know, there'll be questions." Cullen paused with his hand on the door handle and looked back over his shoulder. "Yes," he said mildly. To suspect there will be." Then they stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, leaving the saloon and its stunned occupants behind them. Eleanor's torn sleeve caught the breeze, fluttering like a battle flag as they walked away from the battlefield where her secret life had been transformed into public knowledge. The news spread through Cedar Bluff faster than wildfire in dry grass. By evening, every household in town knew that Eleanor Wade, the fallen seamstress who lived above Henderson's store, was married to Cullen Holt, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. The revelation didn't just change how people saw Eleanor, it shattered their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. Eleanor discovered this transformation the very next morning when she ventured to Henderson's store for her weekly supplies. Mrs. Catherine Henderson, who had barely acknowledged her existence for the past 2 years, practically flew from behind the counter when Eleanor entered. "Mrs. Holt," Catherine exclaimed, her voice pitched high with nervous excitement. "What an absolute pleasure to see you. I was just telling my husband how we should have guessed a woman of your obvious refinement. Of course you would attract such a distinguished gentleman." Eleanor stood frozen near the door, clutching her small purse and trying to process this dramatic reversal. The same woman who had made her wait 20 minutes last week while serving other customers now bustled around her like an anxious mother hen. "I have some lovely new fabrics that just arrived from Denver," Catherine continued, pulling bolt after bolt from her shelves. "The finest silks and satins, perfect for a lady of your position. And these ribbons, I set them aside, thinking of you the moment they arrived." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. Yesterday she couldn't afford anything beyond basic cotton and simple thread. Today Catherine was displaying merchandise that cost more than Eleanor earned in a month. The bank ledger that Cullen kept at home showed assets that could buy Henderson's entire inventory without making a dent in their resources, but Eleanor had never thought of that wealth as hers to spend frivolously. "Thank you, Catherine, but I only need some thread today," Eleanor said quietly. Catherine's face fell momentarily, then brightened again. Of course, you're being modest, such a becoming quality in a lady. But surely Mrs. Cullen Holt deserves better than to mend her own clothes? I could recommend several excellent seamstresses who—" "I enjoy the work," Eleanor interrupted, more sharply than she intended. The suggestion that her skills were now beneath her station stung in ways she couldn't fully explain. Outside Henderson's store, Eleanor encountered Mrs. Victoria Lawson, the banker's wife and unofficial arbiter of Cedar Bluff society. Victoria had been one of Eleanor's closest friends in the old days, but had cut her dead after the family's financial collapse. Now she approached with arms outstretched and a brilliant smile. "Eleanor, dear, I've been hoping to see you. We simply must catch up. It's been far too long since we've had a proper visit." Eleanor accepted the embrace with bewilderment. "It's been 3 years, Victoria. You haven't spoken to me since—" "Oh, that dreadful misunderstanding." Victoria waved a dismissive hand. "I always knew you were destined for great things. I told Harold just last night, I said, I always knew Eleanor Wade was special. And now look, married to the most successful man in the territory." The conversation continued in this vein, with Victoria gushing about Eleanor's good fortune while carefully avoiding any mention of the years of deliberate snubbing. Eleanor found herself nodding mechanically, her mind reeling from the sudden shift in treatment. By afternoon, Eleanor had received 3 invitations to tea, 2 requests to join the ladies' auxiliary, and 1 proposal that she chair the church's upcoming charity drive. The same women who had made her invisible for 3 years now competed for her attention like children vying for candy. Meanwhile, Cullen faced his own set of challenges. At the bank, Harold Lawson greeted him with unusual enthusiasm, quickly ushering him into his private office and offering his finest whiskey. "Congratulations on your marriage, Mr. Holt," Harold said, settling his considerable bulk behind his impressive mahogany desk. "Eleanor Wade, excuse me. Eleanor Holt is a lovely woman. Lovely family, too, though they had their difficulties in recent years." Cullen accepted the whiskey but didn't drink. "My wife's family history is of no concern to me, Mr. Lawson." Of course, Harold hastened to agree. "I only meant to say that we're delighted to welcome her back into proper society. She'll be a tremendous asset to our community organizations." "She was always an asset to this community," Cullen observed quietly. "Perhaps some people simply failed to notice." Harold's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Indeed. Now, about your business interests, I've been thinking about your expansion plans. With a wife to consider, you might want to invest in some more domestic enterprises. The hotel needs renovation, and there's talk of bringing the railroad through. Here, a man of your position might want to consider real estate opportunities in town." Cullen listened politely as Harold outlined various investment schemes, most of which would conveniently benefit the banker's own interests. The sudden concern for his domestic happiness was transparently motivated by greed, but Cullen had encountered enough such men to feel no surprise at their behavior. At the barber shop, the conversation took a different turn. Jim Morrison, the barber, was a plain-spoken man who had always treated Cullen with straightforward honesty. "Got to admit, Mr. Holt, you surprised us all," Jim said as he stropped his razor. Not that Mrs. Holt isn't a fine woman. Just didn't expect such a quiet courtship. Eleanor values her privacy, Cullen replied. As do I. Fair enough. Though I hope you know what you're taking on. Town's been hard on her. These past years. Some folks carry grudges longer than they ought. This was closer to honest counsel than anything Harold Lawson had offered, and Cullen appreciated it. What sort of grudges? Jim shrugged, focusing on his work. Oh, the usual nonsense. Some people think a woman who falls from grace deserves to stay fallen. They don't like being reminded that their judgment might have been wrong. That evening, Eleanor sat at Cullen's kitchen table in the ranch house that was now her home, staring at the invitations and calling cards that had accumulated throughout the day. The contrast with her previous isolation was so stark it felt surreal. "They think I'm different now," she said as Cullen joined her. "The same people who couldn't spare a kind word when I was struggling now act as if I'm their dearest friend." Cullen poured 2 glasses of wine and settled beside her. "Ah, you different?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I don't think so. I'm still the same person I was yesterday morning. But they see me differently because of your name and your money. Does that anger you?" "It should," Eleanor admitted. "But mostly it just makes me sad. If they could be kind to me now, why couldn't they be kind to me then? What does that say about the kind of people they really are?" Cullen reached for her hand, noting how naturally her fingers intertwined with his. "It says that they're human, with all the weaknesses that implies. The question is what you want to do with their newfound attention." "I don't know," Eleanor confessed. "Part of me wants to reject every invitation, to show them how it feels to be dismissed. But another part of me thinks that would make me just as petty as they've been." "There's no rush to decide," Cullen said gently. "Take time to think about what kind of life you want to build here." Outside their windows, the sun set over Cullen's vast holdings, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in town, people were undoubtedly still discussing the day's revelations, trying to reconcile their preconceptions with this new reality. Eleanor Wade, the seamstress, was gone forever, replaced by Eleanor Holt, the rancher's wife. But the woman herself remained unchanged, still searching for her place in a world that had revealed its fickleness all too clearly. That night, as Eleanor prepared for the bed in the home she still couldn't quite believe was hers, she discovered something that made her heart stop. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had become her dressing room, she found a small wooden box tied with a faded blue ribbon. Inside lay a collection of letters written in Cullen's careful hand letters she had never seen before, dating back to the early days of their acquaintance. With trembling fingers she opened the first envelope, postmarked 6 months ago but never sent. Asterisk, "My dear Eleanor, asterisk, asterisk, I watched you at Henderson's store today, and my heart broke for the loneliness I saw in your eyes. You moved through that place like a ghost among the living, invisible to people who should have seen your worth. I wanted to approach you, to tell you that someone in this town recognizes your grace and strength, but I feared my attention might bring you more gossip than comfort. Asterisk, asterisk. You probably don't remember, but we spoke briefly about the weather. You smiled when you thanked me for helping with your packages, and that smile lit something in me that I thought had died with my Mary and little Sarah. I had forgotten that the heart could feel such things. Again. Asterisk, asterisk. I am writing this letter knowing I will never send it, but perhaps putting these words to paper will help me find the courage to speak them aloud someday. Asterisk, asterisk. With deepest respect, Cullen Holt, asterisk. Eleanor's hands shook as she read. Mary and Sarah, names he had never mentioned. She opened another letter. This one dated 3 months later. Asterisk. My dear Eleanor. Asterisk. Asterisk. Today I learned that your mother has passed, and my heart grieves with yours. I stood in the back of the church during her funeral service, watching you bear your sorrow with such dignity that it humbled me. You have no family. Left now, no one to shield you from this town's casual cruelties, and I wished with every fibre of my being that I could offer you the protection of my name. Asterisk. Asterisk. But what right do I have to burden you with the affections of a man who carries his own ghosts? Mary died of fever 5 years ago, along with our daughter. They are buried in a cemetery in Colorado, and some days I feel as though my heart lies buried with them. What could I offer a woman like you, except the companionship of a broken man? Asterisk. Asterisk. Yet, when I see you walking through town with your head held high despite everything, I think, perhaps we broken souls might find healing in each other's company. Asterisk. Asterisk. Yours in sympathy and admiration, Cullen. Asterisk. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as the truth of their courtship revealed itself through these unsent words. She had thought herself alone in her growing feelings, uncertain whether his kindness stemmed from genuine affection or mere politeness. Now she understood that he had been fighting the same battle, weighing his wounded heart against the possibility of love renewed. The final letter was dated just 2 weeks before their secret wedding. Asterisk. My beloved Eleanor. Asterisk. Asterisk. I can no longer pretend that my feelings for you are anything less than love. When you agreed to walk with me yesterday evening along the creek, and we spoke of books and dreams and all the small things that make life worth living, I knew that I wanted to spend whatever years remained to me in your company. Asterisk. Asterisk. You told me about your father's favorite poem, the one about 2 paths diverging in a wood, and how you sometimes wonder what your life might have been if different choices had been made. I want to tell you that every path, every choice, every moment of sorrow and joy has led you to this place, where our hearts might find each other. Asterisk. Asterisk. I am not a young man, Eleanor. At 42, I am set in my ways and carry burdens that will never fully heal. But I love you with a depth that surprises me daily, and I hope that you might come to love me as well. If you will have me, I would be honored to call you my wife. Asterisk. Asterisk. Tomorrow I will ask you properly, with words spoken aloud instead of hidden on paper. But tonight, I wanted to write down this truth. You are not broken, despite what this town has tried to make you believe. You are whole and beautiful and deserving of every happiness. Asterisk. Asterisk. With all my love, Cullen. Asterisk. Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest, remembering that evening by the creek when he had indeed proposed, his words so carefully chosen that she had sensed the depth of thought behind them. She had said yes, not because she was desperate or grateful, but because she recognized in him the same longing for companionship that burned in her own heart. She found him in his study, reading by lamplight. When she appeared in the doorway holding the letters, he looked up with a mixture of surprise and resignation. I should have told you about those, he said quietly. I meant to remove them before you moved in, but why didn't you send them? Eleanor asked, settling into the chair beside his desk. Cullen set down his book and studied her face in the lamplight. Because a woman should be courted openly, with flowers and proper calls and the approval of her friends, not pursued by a grieving widower who could offer nothing but his own loneliness as companionship. Is that truly how you see yourself? Eleanor reached for his hand. As nothing but loneliness? I saw myself that way until I met you. His fingers tightened around hers. You changed that, Eleanor. You made me remember that there could be joy again, even after terrible loss. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Tell me about Mary and Sarah. Cullen's eyes grew distant, but his voice remained steady. Mary was a teacher in Colorado Springs. She had hair the color of autumn leaves and a laugh that could fill a room. Sarah was 3 years old when the fever took them both. She used to follow me around the ranch, chattering constantly about everything she saw. You loved them deeply. I did, and I grieved them for so long I forgot there might be room in my heart for anything else. He looked at Eleanor directly. But love isn't a finite resource, is it? Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for them. It simply means my heart was bigger than I realized. Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him softly. I'm not trying to replace them, Cullen. I'm grateful they existed, because they made you the man I fell in love with. And I'm grateful for your struggles, he replied, because they made you strong enough to love a man with ghosts. Outside their window, the wind rustled through the cottonwoods that bordered their property, carrying the scent of rain and growing things. They had found each other not despite their scars, but because of them, two souls who understood that healing could happen without forgetting, and that second chances at happiness were perhaps the most precious gifts life could offer. The trouble began 3 days later, with the arrival of Marcus Dane. Eleanor was tending to the kitchen garden when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the morning mist, she saw 3 riders coming up the long drive to the ranch house, 2 rough-looking men flanking a third figure who carried himself with the polished confidence of a successful businessman. Even at a distance, there was something about the central rider that made Eleanor uneasy. Cullen emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth as he watched the approaching visitors. His posture was relaxed but alert, the stance of a man prepared for either conversation or conflict. Eleanor set down her basket of vegetables and moved to stand beside him. The lead rider was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and cold, blue eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. His clothes were expensive but practical, the outfit of someone who could afford the finest but chose not to waste money on ostentation. His companions were clearly hired muscle, their hands never straying far from the guns at their hips. "Mr. Holt," the man said as he dismounted, offering a smile that never reached his eyes. "Marcus Dane. I represent certain business interests in Denver that have taken notice of your impressive operation here." Cullen nodded politely but didn't extend his hand. "Mr. Dane, to what do I owe the pleasure? Straight to business, I like that in a man." Dane's gaze swept over the ranch buildings, the well-maintained fences, and the cattle visible in the distance. "I'm here to discuss a proposition that could be very profitable for both of us." Eleanor felt Cullen's tension increase, though his expression remained neutral. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his unease, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his weight shifted almost imperceptibly onto the balls of his feet. "I'm always interested in hearing legitimate business propositions," Cullen said, carefully. "Excellent." Dane produced a leather portfolio from his saddlebag. "I represent a consortium of investors who are planning to bring the railroad through this territory. The route hasn't been finalized yet, but certain strategic land acquisitions could influence that decision considerably." He opened the portfolio to reveal a detailed map of the surrounding area, with various properties outlined in different colors. The Holt Ranch was marked in bold red lines. "Your property, Mr. Holt, sits in a prime position for what could become a major railroad junction. The Day Consortium is prepared to offer very generous terms for your holdings, enough to set you up comfortably anywhere in the country." Eleanor studied the map over Cullen's shoulder, noting that several other ranches were also marked. Something about the neat precision of the colored boundaries made her skin crawl. "I'm not interested in selling," Cullen said simply. Dane's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Perhaps you should hear the offer before making such a hasty decision. We're talking about enough money to buy 10 ranches this size." "Money isn't the issue," Cullen replied. "This is my home." "Ah, but circumstances change, don't they?" Dane's gaze shifted to Eleanor for the first time, and she felt as if a snake had just slithered across her grave. A man with a new wife might want to consider her comfort and security. Ranch life can be unpredictable, dangerous, even. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor felt Cullen's hand brush against hers, a warning to stay calm. "My wife is perfectly comfortable here," Cullen said, his voice carrying a new edge. "And as for danger, I'm well equipped to handle any threats the tension might arise." Dane chuckled, but the sound held no warmth. "Of course you are. I've heard you have an impressive reputation, Mr. Holt, but reputation is a fragile thing, isn't it? Especially for a man with complicated family circumstances." Eleanor's blood chilled. There was something in Dane's tone that suggested he knew about her past, about the town's treatment of her, perhaps even about their secret marriage. But how could he know such things when he had just arrived? "I'm afraid I don't follow you," Cullen said, though his hand had moved closer to the gun at his hip. "Oh, I think you do." Dane's smile became predatory. A wealthy rancher marrying a woman of reduced circumstances. Some people might question such a union. They might wonder about the lady's motives, or perhaps about certain irregularities in the marriage itself. Eleanor felt as if she had been slapped. The implication was clear. Dane was threatening to spread rumors about her character and their marriage if Cullen didn't cooperate. "I think this conversation is over," Cullen said quietly. "Is it?" Dane began folding the map carefully. "That's unfortunate. The consortium I represent doesn't take rejection well. They've invested considerable time and resources in mapping this territory, and they expect to see results." He remounted his horse with practiced ease, his companions following suit. Before turning to leave, he tipped his hat to Eleanor with mocking courtesy. "Mrs. Holt, it's been a pleasure meeting Cedar Bluff's most celebrated recent bride. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon." As the three riders disappeared into the morning mist, Eleanor found herself shaking with a combination of anger and fear. Dane's visit had been a masterful display of veiled threats and psychological warfare, designed to plant seeds of doubt and anxiety. "He knows about us," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About our marriage, about my past, everything." "Yes," Cullen agreed grimly, "which means he's been gathering information for some time. This wasn't a casual business visit, it was reconnaissance." Eleanor picked up the property deed that Cullen kept in his study that evening, examining the legal language that established his ownership of the ranch. The document represented everything they had built together, but now it felt fragile in her hands, vulnerable to the machinations of men like Marcus Dane. "What do we do?" she asked. Cullen was cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical and practiced. "We prepare for whatever comes next. Men like Dane don't make idle threats, they follow through on them, but they also prefer to work in the shadows, using legal manipulation and intimidation rather than direct confrontation." "Because direct confrontation can be costly," Eleanor observed. "Exactly. Which means our best defense is to make ourselves too expensive to attack." He looked up from his weapon. "But I need you to understand. Eleanor, this could get dangerous. If you want to leave, go stay with Doc Harrison, or—" "I'm not leaving," Eleanor interrupted. "This is my home too, Cullen. Whatever comes, we face it together." Cullen nodded, and in his eyes she saw both pride and worry. They were no longer just a couple navigating the social complexities of small-town life. They had become targets in a larger game, one with stakes they were only beginning to understand. Sheriff Kane's badge caught the morning sunlight as he rode up to the ranch house, but there was no gleam of authority in his eyes, only the hollow look of a man who had compromised his principles and was learning to live with the consequences. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as Cullen stepped out to meet him. Kane had been a family friend once, back when Eleanor's father was alive and the Wade name still carried respect in Cedar Bluff. Now she studied his posture, the slumped shoulders, the way he wouldn't quite meet Cullen's eyes, and knew that Marcus Dane's influence had already begun to spread its poison through their community. "Morning, Mr. Holt," Kane said, dismounting slowly. "I'm afraid I've got some troubling news to share." What kind of news? Cullen's voice remained steady, but Eleanor could see the tension in his stance. Kane pulled a folded document from his vest pocket. There's been some questions raised about your land ownership. Seems someone's found irregularities in the original survey that transferred the Harrison place to you. Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice. The Harrison Ranch had been the cornerstone of Cullen's holdings, the purchase that had established him as a major landowner in the territory. If there were problems with that deed, it could unravel everything he had built. What kind of irregularities? Cullen asked, though Eleanor could tell from his tone that he already suspected the answer. Technical stuff, mostly, Kane said, his discomfort obvious. Boundary disputes, questions about whether old Harrison had clear title to Dudst sell in the first place. The Territorial Land Office wants to review all the paperwork. Cullen took the document and scanned its contents, his expression growing darker with each line. This is a fishing expedition, Kane. Someone's trying to tie up my assets in legal proceedings. Maybe so, Kane admitted. But I've got to serve the notice just the same. There'll be a hearing in 2 weeks. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, unable to remain hidden any longer. Kane's face reddened when he saw her, whether from embarrassment or guilt, she couldn't tell. Sheriff Kane, she said quietly. It's been a long time. Mrs. Holt, he replied, tipping his hat. Congratulations on your marriage. Your father would have been proud. The words rang hollow, and they all knew it. If her father had been alive, Kane never would have allowed himself to be bought so easily. Would he? Eleanor asked. Or would he have been ashamed to see how easily some men abandon their principles when the price is right? Kane flinched as if she had struck him. Eleanor, Mrs. Holt, it's not like that. I'm just doing my job. Whose job? Cullen's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Marcus Dane's? I don't know what you're talking about, Kane said, but his protest lacked conviction. Eleanor studied the sheriff's badge pinned to his chest, the same badge he had worn with pride for 15 years, through cattle rustlers and claim jumpers, through droughts and range wars. Now it seemed tarnished, a symbol of justice corrupted by greed and fear. You know exactly what we're talking about, Eleanor said. The question is whether you're going to let a stranger destroy everything decent about this town. Kane mounted his horse without responding, but Eleanor could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't a bad man, just a weak one, and weakness was exactly what men like Dane exploited most effectively. After Kane rode away, Eleanor and Cullen stood in silence on their porch, watching the dust settle on the road that led to town. The legal notice felt heavy in Cullen's hands, a tangible reminder of how quickly their peaceful life was being dismantled. How long do we have? Eleanor asked. 2 weeks before the hearing, but the damage starts now, Cullen replied. Word will spread that my ownership is in question. Banks will be reluctant to extend credit. Suppliers will want cash in advance. Dane's trying to strangle my operation without ever firing a shot. Eleanor thought about the other properties marked on Dane's map, wondering how many other families were facing similar pressure. This isn't just about our ranch, is it? No, Cullen agreed. He wants the whole valley. Probably told his investors he could deliver a clear corridor for their railroad. That afternoon, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of hiding at the ranch, she rode into town and called on Victoria Lawson. The banker's wife received her. In the parlor, all nervous smiles and false enthusiasm, but Eleanor cut through the pleasantries with surgical precision. Victoria, I need to know something, and I'm asking as someone who once counted you as a friend. Has your husband been approached by Marcus Dane? Victoria's face went pale, confirming Eleanor's suspicions before she even spoke. Eleanor, I don't think. My husband's livelihood is being threatened, Eleanor continued. If Harold's bank is part of this scheme, I need to know. It's not like that, Victoria protested, wringing her hands. Mr. Dane simply pointed out certain opportunities. He suggested that a woman of your background might not be the most suitable wife for such an important man. Eleanor felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. My background? Your family's debts, your years of reduced circumstances, Mr. Dane said there. Might be questions about whether your marriage was entirely legitimate. The attack was even more vicious than Eleanor had imagined. Dane wasn't just threatening Cullen's business, he was systematically destroying Eleanor's reputation, suggesting that their marriage was some kind of fraud or convenience. "And you believed him?" Eleanor asked. Victoria couldn't meet her eyes. "I didn't want to, but Harold said what his greed told him to say," Eleanor interrupted. "Just like Sheriff Kane and everyone else who's forgotten that integrity can't be bought and sold like cattle." Eleanor left the Lawson house with a clearer understanding of what they faced. Dane hadn't just corrupted individual officials, he had poisoned the entire social fabric of Cedar Bluff, turning neighbor against neighbor through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and carefully planted rumors. That evening, she sat with Cullen in their kitchen, planning their response to this coordinated attack. The sheriff's badge lay on the table between them. Kane had returned it that afternoon with a brief note explaining that he could no longer serve as sheriff while his integrity was compromised. "At least one man found his conscience," Cullen observed. "But how many others will?" Eleanor asked. "Dane's been systematic about this. He's probably approached every person of influence in town." "Then we need to find allies outside town," Cullen replied. "People who can't be bought or intimidated." Eleanor nodded, but privately she wondered if such people existed. Dane seemed to have unlimited resources and no scruples about how he used them. They were fighting a war on multiple fronts, legal, social, and economic, against an enemy who had been planning his campaign for months. The badge gleamed dully in the lamplight, a reminder that sometimes even the symbols of justice could be corrupted when good people chose silence over courage. Eleanor found the hidden will entirely by accident while searching her mother's old trunk for something to wear to church, a deliberate act of defiance against those who whispered that she no longer belonged in respectable society. Her fingers brushed against a false bottom in the trunk, and when she pried it loose, a yellowed envelope fell into her lap. The document inside was written in her great-uncle Silas Wade's careful script, dated just 3 months before his death 2 years ago. Eleanor had barely known Silas. He had been her grandfather's younger brother, a bachelor who had spent most of his life prospecting in Colorado and Nevada. She remembered him as a weathered man who visited occasionally, always carrying interesting stones in his pockets and telling wild tales of silver strikes and boom towns. The will was simple and direct, written in Silas's own hand and witnessed by a notary in Denver. Asterisk. "Being of sound mind and body, I, Silas Wade, leave all my earthly possessions to my great-niece Eleanor Wade, daughter of my beloved nephew Thomas Wade, deceased. This includes my mining claims in Colorado, my properties in Nevada, and most particularly the land I purchased along Willow Creek in Cedar Bluff County, which I have reason to believe may prove valuable in the coming years due to railroad expansion." Asterisk. Asterisk. Eleanor is a woman of character who has endured hardship with grace. She deserves better than what fate has given her thus far. Perhaps this inheritance will provide her with the independence and security that every woman should possess. Asterisk. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the coordinates and legal descriptions that followed. The Willow Creek property wasn't just a small parcel, it was nearly 2,000 acres of prime land that bordered both the Holt Ranch and the town of Cedar Bluff. More importantly, according to the notes Silas had included, it contained the only viable water source for miles around and sat directly in the path of the proposed railroad route. A second document, stamped by the Territorial Land Office, confirmed that the property had been legally transferred to Eleanor Wade 6 months before her marriage to Cullen Holt. She had been a woman of substantial means, without even knowing it, owner of land that Marcus Dane would kill to possess. Eleanor sank onto her old bed, the implications washing over her like a cold tide. This wasn't just about Cullen's ranch. It had never been just about Cullen's ranch. Dane had discovered Silas's purchase and realized that the key to his entire railroad scheme lay in the hands of a seamstress who didn't even know she owned it. Everything made terrible sense now. Dane's interest in her background, his threats about their marriage being questioned, his systematic campaign to isolate and intimidate them. He had been trying to force her into a position where she would be desperate enough to sell or vulnerable enough to be cheated out of her inheritance entirely. The most chilling realization was that her marriage to Cullen had actually complicated Dane's plans. As a single woman of reduced circumstances, Eleanor would have been easy to manipulate or defraud. As the wife of the most powerful rancher in the territory, she was protected by both law and her husband's reputation. Dane had been forced to escalate his tactics, attacking both of them to create the chaos he needed to seize her property. Eleanor rode back to the ranch, with the will hidden in her bodice, her mind racing with possibilities and dangers. When she found Cullen in the barn, grooming his horse with the careful attention that characterized everything he did, she could barely contain her excitement and fear. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. Privately, Cullen took one look at her face and led her to his study, closing the door behind them. Eleanor produced the will with shaking hands and watched his expression change as he read. "My God," he breathed. "Eleanor, do you understand what this means?" "It means I'm not the penniless woman everyone thought I was," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of wonder and bitter irony. "It means Marcus Dane has been hunting me, not you." Cullen studied the legal descriptions carefully, his business-trained mind quickly grasping the strategic importance of the property. This land controls water rights for half the valley. Anyone wanting to run a railroad through here would need access to Willow Creek for their steam engines. "And I own it," Eleanor said, still hardly believing the words. "Uncle Silas left me the one piece of land that makes Dane's entire scheme possible." "Which explains why he's been so interested in your personal history," Cullen realized. "He needed to find a way to discredit you, to make people question your right to inherit or your competence to manage such valuable property." Eleanor began to pace the small room, energy coursing through her veins. All his talk about questionable marriages and women of reduced circumstances, he was trying to build a case that I'm not fit to own land worth a fortune. Or setting up grounds to challenge the inheritance itself, Cullen added grimly. If he could prove you were mentally incompetent or morally unfit, he could petition the territorial courts to void the will. The magnitude of Dane's scheme became clear as they talked. He had orchestrated an entire campaign of psychological warfare designed to break Eleanor's spirit and isolate her from anyone who might support her claim. The attacks on their marriage, the legal challenges to Cullen's property, even the corruption of local officials. All of it served the single purpose of making Eleanor desperate enough to sell or vulnerable enough to be cheated. "What do we do now?" Eleanor asked. Cullen was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his desk. "We use the one advantage Dane doesn't know. We have the knowledge that you're not a victim, but the key player in this entire game." "I don't understand." "Dane thinks he's hunting a wounded deer," Cullen explained. "He doesn't realize he's actually stalking a mountain lion. You're not just Cullen Holt's wife anymore, Eleanor. You're one of the largest landowners in the territory. That changes everything." Eleanor felt a strange sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted fundamentally. 3 days ago, she had been the grateful beneficiary of her husband's protection. Now she was a woman of independent means, with power and resources that rivaled anyone in 3 counties. "I need to register this inheritance officially," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "File the proper papers. Establish my legal claim beyond any possible challenge." "Carefully," Cullen warned. "Once Dane realizes you know about the inheritance, he'll become truly dangerous. He's invested too much in this scheme to walk away empty-handed." Eleanor nodded. understanding the stakes with crystal clarity. She was no longer fighting for her husband's ranch or her own reputation. She was fighting for control of land that would determine the future of the entire valley. Marcus Dane had spent months maneuvering to steal her inheritance without her knowledge. Now she would have to outmaneuver him to keep what was rightfully hers. The will lay on Cullen's desk between them, a fragile piece of paper that had transformed Eleanor from victim to victor in the space of a heartbeat. But with that power came new dangers and responsibilities that would test every lesson she had learned about courage, determination, and the price of standing up to those who believed might made right. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said quietly. "Uncle Silas's notes mentioned that he suspected the land might contain mineral deposits as well as water rights. If he was right, this inheritance could be worth far more than even the railroad access." Cullen's eyes widened as the full implications sank in. They weren't just fighting for valuable ranch land, they were potentially sitting on a fortune that would make Marcus Dane's railroad scheme look like pocket change. The hidden will had revealed that Eleanor Wade Holt was not the fallen woman that Cedar Bluff believed her to be, but one of the wealthiest and most powerful landowners in the territory. The question now was whether she could survive long enough to claim what was rightfully hers. Eleanor stood before the full-length mirror in her bedroom, carefully adjusting the pearl buttons on her mother's wedding dress. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, but the garment still carried an elegance that spoke of better times and enduring love. She had chosen to wear it for their public wedding ceremony, a declaration that she was proud of both her heritage and her marriage, regardless of what gossips might whisper. The dress represented everything Marcus Dane sought to destroy: family legacy, personal dignity, and the right to claim one's place in the world without apology. As Eleanor smoothed the delicate lace at the neckles, she thought about her mother wearing this same gown 30 years ago, full of hope for the future and confident in her worth as a woman and wife. "You would be proud of me today, Mama," she whispered to her reflection. "I'm not hiding anymore." The public ceremony had been Cullen's idea, proposed after they had spent 3 days preparing their legal strategy and gathering evidence of Dane's corruption. Rather than skulking in the shadows while their enemies spread lies, they would stand openly before the community and force people to choose sides. "Let them see us together," Cullen had argued. "Let them watch us exchange vows in daylight, with witnesses and celebration. Make it impossible for anyone to question the legitimacy of our marriage or your right to be treated with respect." Eleanor had agreed, but she knew the ceremony would serve another purpose as well. By making themselves visible and vulnerable, they would force Dane to reveal his hand. A man who operated in shadows and relied on intimidation couldn't allow such a public display of defiance to go unchallenged. Downstairs, she could hear the sounds of preparation as friends and hired help arranged flowers and set up tables on the front lawn. Doc Harrison had agreed to officiate, despite the obvious risks to his own reputation. Sheriff Kane, former Sheriff Kane, had volunteered to help with security, his conscience finally overriding his fear of retaliation. The guest list told its own story about Cedar Bluff's divided loyalties. The Lawsons had declined with a transparently false excuse about sudden illness. Thomas Garrett and his cronies were notably absent, but Murphy had closed his saloon for the day to attend, bringing his wife and children. Several of the smaller ranchers who had also been pressured by Dane's consortium had quietly confirmed their attendance, seeing the ceremony as a chance to make their own stand. Most surprising of all, Eleanor had received a visit from Mrs. Catherine Henderson, who had arrived with tears in her eyes and a heartfelt apology. "I've been a coward and a fool," Catherine had admitted. "When that Dane fellow started spreading his poison, I should have defended you instead of believing his lies. A woman who conducted herself with such dignity during her troubles deserves better from her neighbors." Eleanor had accepted the apology gracefully, understanding that courage often came in small steps rather than grand gestures. Catherine's presence at the ceremony would signal to other wavering townspeople that it was safe to support the Holts against Dane's intimidation. As Eleanor made her final preparations, she reflected on how much had changed since that humiliating scene in Murphy's saloon just a week ago. Then, she had been a victim of circumstances beyond her control, dependent on her husband's protection and the grudging tolerance of a community that had written her off. Now, she was a woman of independent means, with the power to shape her own destiny and the responsibility to use that power wisely. The irony wasn't lost on her that Dane's campaign of harassment had actually strengthened her position. By forcing their marriage into the open and attacking their reputations so viciously, he had given them no choice but to fight back with everything they had. The frightened seamstress who had endured years of silent persecution was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that some battles were worth the risk. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Eleanor? May I come in?" Cullen entered carrying a small velvet box, his face serious but warm. He wore a black suit that emphasized his silver hair and steel-grey eyes, looking every inch the successful rancher, but also something more. A man prepared to defend what he cherished most. "I have something for you," he said, opening the box to reveal a pair of pearl earrings. "They belonged to my grandmother, the same woman who owned your wedding ring. I thought you should wear them today." Eleanor accepted the earrings with trembling fingers, touched by the gesture's significance. By offering her his family's heirlooms, Cullen was publicly claiming her as his true wife and equal partner, not the convenient marriage that Dane's rumors suggested. "They're beautiful," she said, fastening them carefully. "But Cullen, are you certain about this ceremony? Once we make this stand, there's no going back. Dane won't be able to let it pass without retaliation." "I'm certain," Cullen replied without hesitation. "Running and hiding hasn't solved anything. It's time to force this fight into the Citos. Open, where we can meet it, on our terms." Eleanor nodded, understanding the wisdom behind his strategy. Dane's power lay in secrecy and manipulation, his ability to work behind the scenes while maintaining a facade of respectability. By staging a public celebration that he couldn't ignore, they were dragging him into the light where his true nature would be exposed. "What do you think he'll do?" Eleanor asked. "Something dramatic," Cullen answered grimly. "He's invested too much in this scheme to let us celebrate our victory publicly. He'll try to disrupt the ceremony in a way that makes us look foolish or illegitimate." Eleanor considered this, her mind working through the possibilities. Or he might try something more direct, use the chaos of the gathering to create an incident that could justify legal action against us. Possibly. That's why I've asked some of our allies to be prepared for trouble. Doc Harrison is armed, and several of the ranchers who've been threatened by Dane's people will be watching for signs of violence. Eleanor took one last look in the mirror, seeing not the broken woman she had been, but the strong woman she had become. The wedding. The dress that had once symbolized hopeful innocence now represented something more complex, the courage to claim one's rightful place in the world, despite opposition, and the wisdom to understand that some fights were worth having. As they prepared to leave the bedroom, Eleanor placed her hand on Cullen's arm. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that marrying you was the best decision I ever made. Not because you rescued me from poverty, but because you saw my worth when I had forgotten it myself." Cullen covered her hand with his own. "The rescue went both ways, Eleanor. You gave me back my faith in the future." They descended the stairs together, moving toward a confrontation that would determine not just their personal happiness, but the fate of the entire valley. Outside, their guests were gathering on the lawn, while somewhere in the distance, Marcus Dane was undoubtedly planning his response to their defiance. The ceremony would serve as both celebration and battleground, a public declaration that Eleanor Wade Holt would no longer be intimidated or marginalized. She owned land worth a fortune, commanded the respect of a good man, and possessed the inner strength to fight for what was rightfully hers. As they stepped onto the front porch, Eleanor saw their guests arranged in a loose semicircle around an improvised altar adorned with wildflowers. The sight filled her with unexpected emotion. After years of isolation, she was surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with her despite the potential consequences. Doc Harrison waited with his Bible, his usually jovial face set in determined lines. Murphy and his family occupied the front row, the saloon owner having traded his apron for his Sunday best. The smaller ranchers and their wives clustered together, their presence a quiet statement of solidarity against the forces trying to drive them from their homes. But even as Eleanor took in the supportive gathering, she noticed the riders on the distant hilltop, dark figures silhouetted against the afternoon sky, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. Marcus Dane had accepted their challenge, and the final confrontation was about to begin. The wedding dress rustled softly as Eleanor walked toward her future, carrying with her the legacy of her mother's love, the strength of her own convictions, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories came to those brave enough to stand up and be counted when it mattered most. The ceremony began at precisely 4 o'clock, with the late afternoon sun casting golden light across the gathered crowd. Cullen's silver pocket, watch his father's timepiece that had kept perfect time through 3 generations, showed the exact moment when Doc Harrison opened his Bible and cleared his throat to address the assembled guests. "Dearly beloved," Doc began, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn, "we are gathered here today to witness and celebrate the public affirmation of marriage between Cullen James Holt and Eleanor Margaret Wade Holt." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for the careful phrasing. By acknowledging that this was an affirmation rather than a first ceremony, Doc was establishing the legitimacy of their existing union while allowing them to celebrate it openly. The distinction would matter in any future legal challenges to their marriage. The crowd was small but significant. Murphy stood with his hat in his hands, his weathered face serious with the gravity of the moment. Several ranch families had positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. The atmosphere was festive but tense, like a celebration held in the eye of a gathering storm. Eleanor held Cullen's hand as Doc spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of standing together against life's challenges. The words carried special weight given their circumstances, and she could see understanding in the faces of their guests, people who knew that this ceremony was about more than romance, that it was a declaration of defiance against those who sought to tear them down. Marriage, Doc continued, is not just the joining of 2 hearts, but the creation of a partnership strong enough to weather any storm. Cullen and Eleanor have already proven the strength of their bond through adversity. Today, we celebrate that triumph. As Doc spoke, Eleanor noticed Cullen's subtle hand signals to their allies positioned around the gathering. The pocket watch in his vest caught the sunlight as he checked the time. Everything was proceeding according to plan, but they all knew that Marcus Dane's response would come soon. The first sign of trouble was a dust cloud on the eastern road. Eleanor spotted it over Doc Harrison's shoulder and felt her pulse quicken. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Dane had waited until the ceremony was well underway before making his move. Cullen followed her gaze and gave an almost imperceptible nod to Murphy, who casually shifted his position to block one approach to the altar. Other guests noticed the silent communication and began to tense, though they maintained the appearance of focused attention on the ceremony. "Do you, Cullen James Holt," Doc continued, his voice steady despite the approaching threat, "take Eleanor Margaret to be your wife, to honor and cherish her as an equal partner in all things?" "I do," Cullen replied firmly, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face despite the danger building around them. The dust cloud resolved into a group of riders, moving at deliberate speed, not rushing, but approaching with the inexorable certainty of men confident in their purpose. Eleanor could make out Marcus Dane at their head, flanked by the same hired guns who had accompanied him on his first visit to the ranch. "And do you—" "Eleanor Margaret Wade Holt," Doc asked, emphasizing her full legal name. "Take Cullen James to be your husband, to stand with him as an equal partner against all who would oppose your union." Eleanor's voice rang clear and strong across the gathering. "I do." The approaching riders were close, enough now that their horses' hooves could be heard drumming against the packed earth of the road. The wedding guests began to turn, their festive mood shifting to something harder and more determined. Doc Harrison closed his Bible with deliberate care, his movements unhurried despite the obvious threat. "Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, and in the presence of these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife again and always." The last words carried a note of defiant humor that drew appreciative chuckles from the crowd, but the laughter died as Dane's party crested the small hill that led to the ranch house. There were 8 riders in total, all armed and arranged in a formation that suggested military training. Eleanor felt Cullen's hand tighten around hers as they turned to face the approaching threat together. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, a reminder that they had timed everything perfectly, that this confrontation was happening exactly when and where they wanted it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cullen called out to their guests, his voice carrying absolute authority, "it appears we're about to have uninvited visitors. I ask that you remain calm and allow me to handle this situation." Marcus Dane reined in his horse 20 yards from the wedding party, his cold blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene. He was dressed for business rather than violence, an expensive suit that projected respectability while his hired guns did the work of intimidation. "Mr. Holt, Mrs. Holt," he called out, his voice carrying a false cordiality that fooled no one. "What a touching scene, though I'm afraid I have some business to discuss that simply can't wait." The timing was perfect from Dane's perspective, a public humiliation designed to destroy the ceremony's symbolism and reduce Eleanor to tears before the gathered witnesses. But he had made one crucial miscalculation. He still thought he was dealing with the broken woman who had endured years of silent suffering. The woman in the wedding dress who stepped forward to meet his challenge was someone entirely different. Eleanor stepped forward before Cullen could intervene, her mother's wedding dress rustling with quiet authority. In her hand, she held the marriage certificate that Doc Harrison had just signed, the legal document that would make it impossible for anyone to question the legitimacy of their union. "Mr. Dane," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence like a bell, "how thoughtful of you to attend our celebration, though I don't recall extending an invitation." Dane's confident smile faltered slightly at her calm demeanor. He had clearly expected tears, protestations, or appeals to her husband for protection. Instead, he faced a woman who stood with the poise of someone accustomed to command. "Mrs. Holt," he replied, recovering his composure, "I'm afraid I bring troubling news that requires immediate attention. There are serious questions about your right to use that name." A murmur rippled through the wedding guests, but Eleanor raised her hand for silence. "What questions might those be?" "Legal questions," Dane said, producing a folder from his coat. "It's come to my attention that certain property transfers associated with your marriage may not be entirely legitimate. The territorial court has issued an injunction freezing all assets until the matter can be resolved." The document he brandished looked official enough to convince anyone who didn't examine it closely. Eleanor, however, had spent the past 3 days learning everything she could about territorial law and property rights. "May I see this alleged injunction?" she asked politely. Dane hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Eleanor to know that the document was either fraudulent or obtained through false pretenses. "I'm afraid it's a matter for the courts now. You'll need to come with me to Cedar Bluff for questioning." "Will I?" Eleanor's tone remained conversational, but there was steel beneath the silk. "And under whose authority would you compel me to do so?" "The boat authority of the territorial government. Dane blustered. "I'm acting as an appointed representative. Show me your credentials," Eleanor interrupted. "Show me the official appointment that gives you the right to interrupt a private ceremony and make demands of citizens." Dane's face darkened, as he realized that Eleanor wasn't the easily intimidated woman he had expected. His hired guns shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. "Mrs. Holt," Dane said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. Come, quietly now, and this matter can be resolved without embarrassment." Eleanor smiled, an expression that would have chilled Marcus Dane to the bone if he had been wise enough to recognize it. "Mr. Dane, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about who holds the power in this situation." She reached into her bodice and withdrew the hidden will, holding it up so that everyone present could see it clearly. "You see, I've recently discovered that I inherited substantial property from my great-uncle Silas Wade. Property that includes water rights, mineral claims, and most importantly, the only viable route for a railroad through this valley." The color drained from Dane's face as he realized what she was holding. His entire scheme depended on Eleanor remaining ignorant of her inheritance or being too powerless to protect it. "That document is a forgery," he said, desperately. "Another attempt to defraud. This document was filed with the Territorial Land Office 6 months ago," Eleanor interrupted. "It's been verified by 3 different attorneys and registered with the proper authorities. I am the legal owner of 2,000 acres of prime railroad land, and you, Mr. Dane, have been trying to steal it through intimidation and fraud." Doc Harrison stepped forward, his Bible replaced by a shotgun that he held with practiced ease. "That sounds like a criminal matter to me. Perhaps we should send word to the federal marshals." Murphy and several of the ranchers moved to flank Eleanor and Cullen, their own weapons now visible. What had started as a wedding reception had transformed into a confrontation between the law-abiding citizens of Cedar Bluff and a gang of would-be thieves. Dane looked around frantically, realizing that his carefully laid plans had collapsed completely. He had expected to face a frightened seamstress and her protective husband. Instead, he found himself confronting a woman who not only knew her legal rights, but commanded the respect and support of the entire community. "This isn't over," he snarled, his mask of respectability finally slipping completely. "You have no idea what forces you're opposing, men with real power. Men who sent a small-time con artist to do their dirty work?" Eleanor asked pleasantly. "Mr. Dane, I'm sure your employers will be very interested to learn how thoroughly you've bungled this operation." Eleanor held up the marriage certificate, making sure everyone could see the official seal and signatures. "This document establishes my legal right to my husband's name and protection. The will establishes my independent ownership of the most valuable land in 3 counties. And the witnesses here today will testify that you came to my home with armed men and attempted to kidnap me based on fraudulent legal documents." Dane's hired guns were looking increasingly nervous as they realized they had been led into a trap. What they had thought was simple. Intimidation had become a federal crime with dozens of witnesses. The marriage certificate rustled in the afternoon breeze, a symbol of legitimacy and legal protection that Marcus Dane could never challenge successfully. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the front porch of the new house she and Cullen had built overlooking Willow Creek, watching the morning sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. In her hands, she held a silver-framed photograph, their official family portrait taken just last week, showing her and Cullen dressed in their finest clothes, standing proudly before the ranch that had become the foundation of a small empire. The transformation of Cedar Bluff had been remarkable to witness. Where Marcus Dane's railroad consortium had promised only exploitation and displacement, Eleanor's careful development of her inheritance had brought genuine prosperity to Cumnussa. The entire valley, The water rights from Willow Creek now supplied 3 new businesses in town, while the mineral surveys had revealed silver deposits valuable enough to fund schools, roads, and improvements that benefited everyone. Eleanor had insisted on profit-sharing agreements with the smaller ranchers whose land bordered her property, ensuring that the wealth generated by mining and railroad access lifted the entire community rather than just enriching herself and Cullen. It was a radical departure from the usual business practices of the time, but Eleanor had lived through poverty and understood its corrosive effects on both individuals and communities. The railroad had indeed come through, just as Dane had predicted, but under terms that Eleanor negotiated herself. The depot sat on land she had donated to the town, with the stipulation that local businesses would receive preferential rates for shipping their goods to market. What Dane had envisioned as a tool for outside exploitation had become a catalyst for local prosperity. Thomas Garrett had been among the first to benefit from the new opportunities, though it had taken him weeks to work up the courage to approach Eleanor directly. When he finally appeared at her door, hat in hand and face burning with shame, she had received him with the quiet dignity that had become her trademark. "I came to apologize," he had said, unable to meet her eyes, "and to thank you. The shipping contract for my defense cattle, you could have given it to anyone, but you chose me despite what I said that day in Murphy's." Eleanor had studied his face for a long moment before responding. "Thomas, we all make choices we regret when we're angry or hurt. The question is what we do afterward to make things right." She had offered him a chair on her porch and served him coffee, treating him with the same courtesy she showed to any neighbor. By the end of their conversation, Thomas had become one of her most vocal supporters, his genuine remorse transforming him from enemy to ally. Marcus Dane had simply vanished after the confrontation at the wedding. His hired guns had scattered when faced with the prospect of federal charges, and Dane himself had disappeared into the night rather than face the consequences of his failed scheme. Word had eventually filtered back that he had been arrested in Denver on charges related to other fraudulent railroad deals, but Eleanor felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that the threat was ended. The real victory had been watching Cedar Bluff rediscover its sense of community. Sheriff Kane had been reinstated by popular demand, his conscience cleansed by his decision to stand with the Holts when it mattered most. The Lawsons had quietly left town, unable to face the daily reminder of their moral cowardice, but others had found the courage to apologize and rebuild their relationships with Eleanor. Mrs. Henderson had become one of Eleanor's closest friends. Their shared experience of recognizing and overcoming their own weaknesses, creating a bond stronger than their previous superficial acquaintance. Victoria Lawson's replacement as the unofficial arbiter of local society, Catherine Henderson, brought a warmth and inclusivity to social gatherings that had been missing during the years of rigid hierarchy. But perhaps the most satisfying change had been in Eleanor herself. The frightened seamstress who had endured years of cruel whispers was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood her own worth and within Bass refused to accept less than she deserved. She had learned to wield power with both strength and compassion, using her resources to lift others rather than simply protecting herself. The photography studio in Cedar Bluff had become a thriving business, largely due to Eleanor's patronage. She commissioned family portraits for every family in the valley, understanding that having a formal photograph was both a luxury and a statement of dignity that many had never been able to afford. The new family portrait that hung in her parlor was just one of dozens that now graced homes throughout the county. Cullen emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, settling beside her on the porch swing they had installed to catch the morning light. He still wore the silver pocket watch that had timed their confrontation with Dane, but now it marked peaceful moments rather than dangerous ones. "Any regrets?" he asked, following her gaze across the valley that had become their domain. Eleanor considered the question seriously, as she did all matters of importance. About the money, the power, the responsibility, about any of it, about us. She turned to look at him, this man, who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself, who had stood beside her through battles both personal and public, who had loved her not for what she could bring him but for who she truly was. "Never," she said firmly. "Every challenge, every moment of fear, every sleepless night, worrying about what came next, it was all worth it to arrive at this moment." Cullen nodded, understanding passing between them without need for words. They had built something together that transcended the simple joining of two lonely hearts. They had created a partnership that had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. The family portrait caught the morning light, reflecting their faces back at them, a man and woman who had found love in their maturity, who had faced down enemies and emerged victorious, who had learned that the greatest success came not from accumulating wealth, but from using it wisely. Eleanor Wade Holt, once the scorned seamstress of Cedar Bluff, was now the most respected woman in 3 counties. But more importantly, she was happy deeply, genuinely happy in a way she had never imagined possible during those dark years of struggle and isolation. The portrait would hang in their home for generations, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who refuse to surrender when life seemed darkest.